Arthur Luna, the chief financial officer of James and Luna Holdings, stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the snow begin to dust the city. At 42, Arthur was the embodiment of American corporate success, sharp, disciplined, and profoundly lonely. His life was a series of spreadsheets, quarterly earnings calls, and high-stakes negotiations. He had mastered the art of the deal, but he had forgotten the art of living. In his hand, he held a thick, cream-colored invitation. The Unity and Heritage Gala was the event of the season, a night where the city's elite gathered to pretend they cared about the poor while sipping champagne that cost more than a minimum-wage monthly salary. His ex-wife, a woman whose ambition had eventually outpaced her affection for him, would be there with her new fiancé. The thought of attending alone, or worse, with a superficial +1 from a high-end dating agency, made his stomach churn. Restless, Arthur decided to walk to the gala's venue instead of taking his car. He needed the bite of the cold to feel something. As he turned the corner near an abandoned theater, he saw her. Maya was sitting on a plastic crate, huddled under a doorway. She wasn't begging. She was reading a weathered paperback book to a small girl wrapped in a faded pink coat. The girl, Lily, couldn't have been more than 6. Maya's voice was soft but steady, creating a world of magic and safety amidst the gray slush of the sidewalk. Arthur stopped, mesmerized. There was a dignity in her posture that defied her circumstances. Her face, though tired and marked by the harshness of the streets, possessed a striking, timeless beauty. "It's a long walk to the north side in this weather, sir," Maya said without looking up, her voice cutting through the wind. Arthur realized he had been staring. I was just taking in the air." "The air is free. Most things in this city aren't," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. Her gaze was piercing, devoid of the pity or desperation he usually saw in the eyes of the homeless. An impulsive, reckless idea took hold of Arthur. It was a business proposition, but one wrapped in a human experiment. "How much would it take for you to spend an evening in a room full of people who think they own the world?" Maya frowned, pulling Lily closer. "I'm not that kind of girl, mister." "No, you misunderstand," Arthur said quickly, reaching for his checkbook. "I need a date for a gala, a dinner. No strings, no expectations. Just your presence and your honesty. I'll pay you $10,000. Enough for a deposit on an apartment and a fresh start for your daughter." Maya looked at the checkbook, then at Lily's shivering frame, and then back at Arthur. "Why me?" "Because," Arthur said, "everyone at that party is wearing a mask. I think you're the only person in this city who isn't." The transformation did not happen in a fairy tale castle, but in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria. Arthur had hired a team of professionals, stylists, tailors, and a nanny for Lily, but he gave them strict instructions. Don't change who she is, just let her shine. While Lily played with a set of new wooden blocks in the living room, Maya sat in the vanity chair. She felt like an imposter. The touch of silk against her skin felt alien after years of coarse denim and layers of donated sweaters. She looked at herself in the mirror as the stylist worked. The grime of the streets was washed away, revealing skin that glowed with a hidden resilience. They dressed her in a deep emerald green gown, simple, elegant, and commanding. It matched the color of her eyes, which now held a spark of nervous anticipation. Arthur waited in the hallway. When Maya stepped out, he actually lost his breath. It wasn't just the dress or the hair, it was the way she carried herself. She looked like a queen who had been wandering in exile and had finally decided to reclaim her throne. "You look..." Arthur struggled for the word. "You look like yourself." "I feel like I'm wearing a costume, Arthur," Maya whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "We all are," he reassured her, offering his arm. "Tonight, we just have better fabric." In the car on the way to the museum where the gala was held, Arthur briefed her. "There will be people who will try to condescend to you. There will be people who will ask about your background. You don't have to lie, but you don't have to give them everything either. You are my guest. That is all they need to know." Maya looked out the window at the familiar streets she had slept on just 48 hours ago. The neon lights of the diners and the shadows of the alleys looked different from the back of a Maybach. "They won't see me," she said softly. "They'll see the dress." Then we'll make sure they hear you, Arthur replied. As they arrived, the flashes of the paparazzi were blinding. Arthur felt Maya's arm tighten around his. He covered her hand with his, a silent promise of protection. They stepped onto the red carpet, the CFO and the woman from the doorway, entering a den of lions where the only currency was status. The grand ballroom of the Field Museum was filled with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars above a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. As Arthur and Maya entered, a hush rippled through the immediate crowd. Arthur Luna was known for his icy demeanor and his solitary nature. To see him with a woman of such striking, unconventional beauty was the gossip of the hour. "Arthur, you actually made it!" a voice boomed. It was Julian Vane, the CEO of a rival firm, a man who measured his worth by the size of his yacht. Beside him stood Elena, Arthur's ex-wife, looking impeccable in silver sequins. "Julian." "Elena," Arthur said with a stiff nod. "This is Maya." Elena's eyes swept over Maya like a laser, searching for a brand name or a social pedigree. "Maya, what a lovely name. And that dress, is it vintage?" "It's new to me," Maya said, her voice clear and calm. She didn't flinch under Elena's scrutiny. "And where did Arthur find such a hidden gem?" Julian asked, his tone bordering on predatory. "I thought I knew everyone in the Chicago circuit." "Maya is a specialist in human resources," Arthur intervened smoothly. "She has a unique perspective on the city's untapped potential." The conversation moved to the economy, to the latest mergers, and to the skyrocketing real estate prices in the Gold Coast. Maya listened, her expression unreadable. She heard them talk about cleaning up the streets and urban revitalization, as if the people living in those areas were mere statistics, obstacles to be moved rather than lives to be lived. Dinner was served at a long candlelit table. Maya found herself seated between a philanthropic socialite and a city councilman. The socialite, a woman named Mrs. Gable, leaned in. "So, Maya, tell me about your charity work. Which boards do you sit on?" Maya took a slow sip of her water. She thought of the soup kitchen on 4th Street where she had spent her Tuesday mornings. She thought of the community garden where she had taught Lily how to plant radishes in a plastic tub. "I focus on direct action, Mrs. Gable," Maya said. "I find that the most impactful work happens on the ground, away from the boardrooms. Have you ever spent a night in a shelter?" The table went silent. Mrs. Gable blinked, her pearls clicking together. "Well, I attend the fundraisers, of course." "Attending a fundraiser is a beautiful thing," Maya said, her voice holding no malice, only a quiet intensity. "But it's like reading a book about a fire while standing in a rainstorm. You know the theory, but you don't feel the heat." Arthur watched her from across the table, a slow smile forming on his lips. She wasn't just surviving the night, she was challenging it. As the night progressed, the atmosphere grew more relaxed with the flow of wine. But Maya felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She excused herself and found a quiet balcony overlooking the darkened hall of the museum, where the skeletons of dinosaurs stood as silent witnesses to history. Arthur followed her a few minutes later. "You're the talk of the room, you know. Mrs. Gable thinks you're a fascinating radical." Maya leaned against the stone railing. "I'm just a woman who's tired of people talking about the poor, as if we're a different species. They talk about solutions while they eat caviar that could feed my daughter for a year." "I know," Arthur said, standing beside her. "I've been one of them for a long time. Tonight is the first time I've actually felt ashamed of it." "Why did you do this, Arthur?" "Really?" Maya asked, turning to face him. "You didn't need a date. You could have hired a supermodel." Arthur looked out at the city lights. "I wanted to see if there was anything real left in this world. I've spent 20 years building a fortress around myself. I have the money, the power, the respect, and I have absolutely no one who knows who I am when the lights go out. Seeing you with Lily, the way you looked at her, the way you protected her, I realized I've never had that, and I've never given it." For a moment, the gap between the billionaire and the homeless mother vanished. They were just two people standing in the dark, acknowledging their scars. The moment was broken by Julian Vane, who stumbled onto the balcony, clearly intoxicated. There you are, Arthur, you dog. You're keeping her all to yourself. He turned to Maya, his eyes wandering disrespectfully. You know, Maya, I have a position opening up at my firm. Personal assistant. Very personal. The pay is much better than whatever Arthur is giving you. Arthur's jaw tightened. Julian, you're drunk. Go back inside. Oh, come on, Arthur. We know how this works. You find a pretty face, you dress her up, you have your fun. I'm just asking for a turn. Before Arthur could react, Maya stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't lose her poise. She looked Julian directly in the eye, her voice like cold steel. Mr. Vane, you confuse wealth with worth. You have a lot of the former, but based on the last 5 minutes, you have very little of the latter. I am not a turn. I am a human being, and I suggest you find some coffee before you say something you'll regret when you're sober. Julian sputtered, stunned by her directness, and retreated back into the ballroom. Arthur looked at Maya with newfound reverence. I think, Arthur said, you just did what I've wanted to do for 10 years. The gala reached its peak with the charity auction. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like polished mahogany, called for the crowd's attention. The goal was to raise $5 million for urban renewal initiatives. One by one, the wealthy donors raised their paddles, bidding on luxury vacations, rare wines, and private concerts. Elena, Arthur's ex-wife, was in her element, loudly outbidding a rival for a diamond necklace. And now, the auctioneer announced, we have a special presentation, a testimonial from one of our success stories. A young man walked onto the stage. He was dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, looking terrified. He began to give a rehearsed speech about how a local program had helped him get off the streets. It was sterilized, polished, and stripped of any real pain. Maya watched from the shadows. She saw the man's hands shaking. She saw the way the audience looked at him, with a mixture of pity and self-congratulation. They weren't seeing a man. They were seeing a trophy of their own generosity. She couldn't stay silent. As the auctioneer asked for the final round of donations, Maya walked toward the stage. Arthur started to reach for her, then stopped. He realized this was her moment. She didn't take the microphone. She just stood at the edge of the stage, waiting for the room to fall silent. And it did. The sheer presence of her, the emerald dress, the fire in her eyes, demanded it. My name is Maya, she began, her voice carrying through the hall without the need for amplification. 2 nights ago, I was sleeping in a doorway on 5th and Main. My daughter was cold, and I didn't know if we would eat the next day. A collective gasp went through the room. Elena dropped her champagne glass. You are bidding on renewal, Maya continued. But renewal isn't a building. It's not a park. It's a mother who doesn't have to choose between a coat for her child and a meal. It's a man who can walk into a room like this and not feel like a charity case. You give your money, and you feel good. But do you see us? Do you really see us? She looked at Arthur. This man gave me $10,000 to be here tonight. To him, it's a rounding error on a balance sheet. To me, it's a life. But the most important thing he gave me wasn't the money. It was the fact that he looked at me and saw a person. Not a problem to be solved. A person. She turned back to the crowd. Don't just write the check. Open your eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, and profound. The gala ended abruptly for Arthur and Maya, the air behind them still vibrating with the shock of her words. They didn't stay for the final toast or the hollow applause of the elite. Instead, they slipped out the back exit, their breath visible in the biting Chicago night as they navigated the service corridor to avoid the reporters already swarming the front entrance. Inside the leather-scented cocoon of Arthur's Maybach, the silence was heavy, filled with the echoes of Maya's speech. The city lights blurred past them, neon blues and sharp whites reflecting off the polished emerald silk of Maya's dress. I'm sorry if I ruined your reputation, Maya said quietly, staring down at her hands. The manicured nails looked strange to her, a stark contrast to the rough life she had led just 48 hours prior. Ruined it? Arthur laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that seemed to surprise even him. Maya, you just gave that room the first honest moment it's had in a decade. My board of directors might be annoyed, but for the first time in my life, I don't care what they think. I watched their faces. You didn't just speak. You stripped them of their pretenses. They arrived back at the hotel in a state of quiet reflection. Upstairs, the luxury suite felt like a different world. Lily was fast asleep, tucked into a bed with 1,000 thread-count sheets, her small chest rising and falling in the first deep, safe sleep she had known in years. A stuffed bear, a gift Arthur had arranged, was clutched tightly in her arms. Maya stood by the bed, the emerald dress looking beautiful yet tragically out of place in the domestic scene of a sleeping child. "The money is in an escrow account," Arthur said softly, leaning against the doorframe, his tuxedo jacket finally discarded. "It's yours. $10,000. Exactly as promised. No strings, no hidden fees. I've also instructed my personal assistant to spend tomorrow helping you find a permanent apartment in a safe neighborhood and getting Lily enrolled in a school that will actually challenge her. You don't have to go back to that doorway, Maya. Not tonight, not ever." Maya turned to him, the golden light of the bedside lamp catching the tears brimming in her eyes. "Why are you doing all this, Arthur? The 10,000 was for the dinner. This, the hotel, the school, the protection. It's too much." "It's not enough," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper so as not to wake the girl. "I spent 40 years thinking that success was a destination, a mountain of gold I had to climb. You showed me tonight that success is just a platform. What matters is what you do once you're standing on it. I've had the platform for years, but I've been standing on it alone. You gave me a reason to look down and see who else was there." He stepped closer, reaching out as if to brush a stray hair from her forehead, but he caught himself. He didn't want this to feel like a transaction, a payment for her company. He wanted her to feel her own power. "Go to sleep, Maya," he said gently. "Tomorrow is the first day of your new life. Real life." As he left the suite, Arthur didn't head to his own penthouse. He walked the streets of the Loop for hours, the cold no longer biting quite as hard. He looked at the shadows in the doorways, at the steam rising from the grates, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He saw the people. He saw the stories hidden behind the grime, and he knew he could never go back to being the man he was before the gala. The news of the Gala scandal broke with the force of a tidal wave the next morning. Headlines across the city screamed about the homeless Cinderella and the CFO's $10,000 date. Some columnists praised Maya's bravery, calling her a voice for the voiceless, but the corporate world was far less kind. In the sterile, high-altitude offices of James and Luna, the air was thick with hostility. Arthur arrived at his office to find the senior partners already assembled in the conference room. Julian Vane was there too, looking smug, flanked by 2 lawyers in sharp gray suits. "You've made us a laughingstock, Arthur," James, the senior partner, barked, slamming a copy of the Chicago Tribune onto the mahogany table. "Associating with a vagrant, bringing her into the Heritage Gala, it's a liability to our brand. Our investors are calling, asking if the man in charge of their billions has lost his mind." "She's a human being, James," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low as he took his seat at the head of the table. "And from what I saw last night, she's more intelligent and capable than half the people on our payroll who spend their days hiding behind spreadsheets." "Be that as it may," Julian Vane interjected, his voice oily with false concern. "The board is calling for a vote of confidence. I've already spoken to several key stakeholders. They are concerned about your judgment. I'm formally recommending your immediate resignation. There are also rumors, Arthur. Rumors that you used company funds for this little social experiment. Misuse of corporate assets is a felony." "The 10,000 came from my personal checking account, Julian," Arthur snapped, leaning forward. "And you know it. You're not worried about the company. You're worried because she made you look like the fraud you are." While the battle raged in the boardroom, Maya was facing a different kind of siege. The hotel lobby was packed with paparazzi and true crime influencers. She felt trapped again. But this time, the walls were made of gold and marble. When she tried to slip out a side entrance to get milk and some simple snacks for Lily, she was swarmed. "Maya, is it true you're a professional con artist?" a reporter yelled, shoving a microphone toward her face. "Did you target Arthur Luna? How much are you blackmailing him for?" Another shouted. Lily began to cry, clinging to Maya's leg as the flashes of cameras exploded like miniature lightning strikes. Maya retreated back into the hotel, her heart pounding against her ribs. She realized with a sickening clarity that the world wasn't going to let her have a new life easily. They wanted her to stay in the box they had built for her, either a victim to be pitied or a villain to be judged. They couldn't accept that she was just a mother who had been given a chance to survive. Fearing for Lily's safety, she called Arthur. Her voice was trembling. "They're here. They won't leave us alone. They're saying horrible things, Arthur. They're making me sound like a criminal." "Stay inside, Maya," Arthur said, his voice a pillar of strength through the phone. "I'm leaving the office now. I've sent a private security detail to your floor. Pack your things, and the new ones. I'm taking you to my estate in the countryside. There's a gate, a perimeter, and peace. They can't get to you there. Arthur, your job, your reputation. I'm ruining everything you've built," Maya cried. "No, Maya," Arthur said firmly. "You're the only thing worth building right now. Just hold on, I'm coming." The Luna estate was a sprawling manor tucked away in the rolling hills of northern Illinois, surrounded by ancient oaks that stood like silent sentinels and a high stone wall that felt less like a prison and more like a fortress of solitude. For the first week, it was a sanctuary in every sense of the word. The silence of the countryside was a healing balm, a sharp contrast to the constant grinding roar of the Chicago L trains and the sirens that had been the soundtrack to Maya and Lily's life for so long. Lily ran through the vast gardens, her laughter a sound that the old, dusty house had lacked for decades. She discovered a hidden koi pond and spent hours watching the orange and gold fish glide through the dark water. For the first time, she wasn't asking if they had to move. She was asking if the flowers would bloom tomorrow. Maya slowly began to shed the hyper-vigilance of the streets. The physical transition was striking. Her hands, once cracked from the cold, began to heal. She no longer jumped at the sound of a floorboard creaking or slept with her shoes on, prepared to run at a moment's notice. She spent her days in the massive library, a 2-story cathedral of knowledge. There, she rediscovered the education she had been forced to abandon, books on sociology, law, and history. She wasn't just reading, she was arming herself with the language of the world that had tried to erase her. In the evenings, she and Arthur would sit by the massive stone fireplace in the great hall. The only sound was the crackling of cedar logs and the occasional chime of a grandfather clock. They talked with a depth that bypassed the superficiality of their initial meeting. Maya told him about David, her husband, a man who had survived 2 tours of duty only to be broken by a healthcare system that saw him as a series of billing codes. She described the slow, agonizing descent, the medical bills that ate their savings, the grief that turned into a fog, and the day the sheriff arrived to change the locks. "It's a domino effect," Maya whispered, watching the embers. "You lose the house, so you lose the address. You lose the address, so you can't get the job. You can't get the job, so you lose your dignity. Pretty soon, the world just looks through you." Arthur, in turn, opened up about the emotional vacuum of his upbringing. He spoke of a father who measured love in quarterly dividends, and a mother who was a ghost in her own home, medicated into a polite silence. "I think," Arthur said one night, "that I've been homeless in a different way than you, Maya. I had a roof, but I didn't have a home. I was a ghost in a very expensive suit, haunting my own life." "You have a home now," Maya said softly, reaching out to place her hand over his. It was the first time she had initiated contact, and the warmth of it felt more significant than any gala or check. But the outside world was not done with its cruelty. Julian Vane, driven by a mixture of spite and a desperate need to protect his own crumbling secrets, had hired a high-end private investigator. They found what they were looking for in a dusty archive, an old unpaid medical lien from the hospital where David had passed. Because of a clerical error and Maya's lack of a permanent address, the debt had been flagged under suspicious circumstances by an aggressive collection agency. One afternoon, a black SUV pulled up to the heavy iron gates. A process server, cold and indifferent, handed a manila envelope to Arthur's security team. It was a summons for Maya to appear in court, along with a petition of concern regarding Lily's welfare, filed anonymously. It cited Maya's unstable history and involvement in public scandals as grounds for an investigation into her fitness as a mother. "He won't stop," Maya said, her face pale as she read the legal jargon. He's going to use my poverty as a weapon to take my daughter. He's going to tell a judge that because I slept on a sidewalk, I don't deserve her. Arthur took the papers. His eyes were cold, reflecting the steel of the man who had conquered the financial world. He didn't look worried. He looked dangerous. He thinks he's playing a game of checkers, Arthur said, his hand steady on her shoulder. But I've been playing chess in this city for 20 years. I've seen his books, Maya. I know where the bodies are buried, and he has no idea what happens when a man like me finally has something worth fighting for. Arthur didn't go to his corporate lawyers this time. He knew their loyalties were tied to the firm's stock price, and that their primary objective would be damage control, which usually meant silencing the victims. Instead, he reached out to a small group of retired forensic accountants, men who had spent their lives untangling the knots of white-collar crime, and a private legal firm that specialized in corporate whistleblowing. He spent 3 days locked in his study, the room smelling of old paper, stagnant air, and bitter, lukewarm coffee. The desk was a battlefield of printouts and digital tablets. He was working the phones, cross-referencing shell companies, and tracking offshore wire transfers with a precision that only a man who had built those systems could possess. He discovered that Julian Vane hadn't just been cutting corners for minor profit. He had been running a sophisticated, multi-layered embezzlement scheme through the very urban renewal projects he championed at the Gala. Julian was using cheap, hazardous materials in low-income housing, insulation that was a fire hazard, lead-based paint sourced from overseas, and compromised structural steel, all while pocketing the difference through a series of complex Cayman Island accounts. He wasn't just stealing money. He was endangering the lives of the very people the Unity and Heritage Gala claimed to protect. On Thursday morning, Arthur arranged a private emergency briefing at the James and Luna headquarters. He requested the presence of the entire board and Julian Vane. The boardroom, located on the 80th floor, felt like an icy aquarium, detached from the reality of the streets below. When Arthur walked in, he wasn't wearing his usual $5,000 tailored power suit. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, his face unshaven but his eyes sharp and clear. He looked more relaxed and far more formidable than anyone in the room. "I'm here to offer my resignation," Arthur began, his voice flat, placing a thick leather folder on the center of the mahogany table. Julian smirked, adjusting his silk tie and looking around at the board members for approval. "A wise choice, Arthur. Save yourself the embarrassment of a public ousting. We'll even provide a modest severance if you leave quietly and sign the non-disclosure agreement." "However," Arthur continued, his voice dropping an octave and echoing with an authority that sucked the air out of the room, "before I go, I think the board should review these documents. It seems Julian has been using the company's charitable trust, the one that funded the Heritage Gala, to fund a luxury resort development in the Caymans. I have the wire transfers, the forged signatures of the subcontractors, and the testimony of the lead architect, who was told to ignore safety codes in the Southside projects. I also have the laboratory reports on the building materials. It's all here. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and reckless endangerment." The color drained from Julian's face, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The other board members leaned in, their eyes widening as they flipped through the undeniable evidence. They saw the shell companies, Vane Horizons, SV Development, Blue Water Holdings. It was a roadmap of a crime. "This is a lie, a desperate, pathetic fabrication," Julian shouted, jumping to his feet so quickly his chair tumbled backward. But his hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. "It's the truth," Arthur said, his voice cold and final. "And the district attorney's office already has a copy of this folder. They're likely waiting at your office right now, Julian. Now, I have a counter-proposal for the board. You drop all investigations into Maya. You use your legal department to clear her medical debts and ensure her record is scrubbed of these manufactured charges. You will personally ensure the petition regarding her daughter is withdrawn and dismissed with prejudice. And Julian, you resign immediately and turn yourself in. If you do that, I might refrain from testifying about the board's gross negligence in failing to catch this for 3 years." The room was deathly silent. The power had shifted in a heartbeat. Arthur wasn't just a man with a checkbook anymore. He was a man with a mission. He stood up, looking at the men he had once considered his peers. Men who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. "One more thing," Arthur said, his hand on the door handle. "I'm not resigning today. I'm taking an indefinite leave of absence. I have a life to build, and it doesn't involve this room. You can find someone else to manage your billions. I'm going to go manage something that actually matters." He walked out, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him with a final echoing thud that sounded like the closing of a chapter. He left the lions to devour each other in the ruins of their own greed, stepping into the elevator and feeling, for the first time in 20 years, that he could breathe. 6 months later. The Chicago spring had arrived with a vengeance, replacing the gray, oppressive slush of winter with vibrant green lawns and the sweet, heavy scent of blooming lilacs. In a quiet, revitalized neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a small but beautiful community center had opened its doors. The building was an old schoolhouse, restored with warm cedar wood, large, sun-drenched windows, and a playground that was always full of children's laughter. It wasn't funded by a flashy gala or a corporate trust looking for a tax write-off. It was funded by Arthur Luna's personal wealth, but it was run entirely by Maya. The Maya Foundation didn't just hand out checks. It was designed based on Maya's own lived experience, the gaps she had fallen through, the doors that had been slammed in her face. It provided gap housing, 10 modest, beautiful apartments for families who were in the fragile transition between the street and stability. It offered job training that actually led to living-wage careers, legal advocacy to fight predatory landlords, and most importantly, high-quality, free childcare, so parents could actually pursue their dreams without the crushing weight of daycare costs. It was a place where people were seen, heard, and respected, not as cases, but as neighbors. Arthur sat on a stone bench in the courtyard, watching Lily play tag with a group of other children. She was wearing a new yellow sundress, her hair neatly braided, her skin glowing with health. She looked every bit the carefree child she was meant to be. Arthur looked 10 years younger. The deep lines of stress around his eyes had faded, replaced by the faint crinkles of someone who actually smiles. He had officially stepped down as CFO, choosing to manage his private investments from a small, modest office in the back of the center. He was no longer a shark, he was a steward. Maya walked out of the main building, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She was dressed in a simple linen blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked radiant, not because of an emerald designer gown, but because of the fire of purpose in her eyes and the strength in her stride. "The new intake of families is settled," she said, sitting down beside him. The warmth of the afternoon sun settled over them. "We have 3 mothers starting their nursing degrees at the local college next week. And we found a pro bono lawyer to help the father in Unit 4 fight his wrongful eviction. He's going to keep his home, Arthur. His kids won't have to change schools." "You did that, Maya," Arthur said, taking the coffee and looking at her with unabashed pride. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from her face, his touch lingering. "We did that," she corrected him, her hand finding his and squeezing it tight. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the two of them watching the sun begin to dip below the Chicago skyline, turning the glass towers in the distance into pillars of fire. They had faced the storms of the city, the cruelty of the press, and the predatory nature of the corporate world, and they had come out the other side. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale. There were still long days, difficult cases, and the emotional scars of the past that occasionally flared up like old injuries in the cold. But it was real. And it was theirs. "Do you ever regret it?" Maya asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "The money, the status, the absolute power you walked away from? The night you spent $10,000 on a woman who didn't even have a home?" Arthur looked at Lily, who was laughing as she chased a butterfly near the lilac bushes. Then he looked at Maya, the woman who had taught him that the greatest wealth isn't what you collect, but what you give away. He thought of the empty penthouse and the cold boardrooms, and then he felt the warmth of Maya's hand in his. "It was the best investment I ever made," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I paid $10,000 to find a date for a dinner I didn't want to attend. But I ended up finding my soul, a daughter, and the woman who saved my life. I finally know what it means to be rich, Maya. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of losing it." As the golden hour bathed the courtyard in a soft, amber light, the former billionaire and the woman from the doorway sat together. They weren't characters in a tabloid story, or figures in a spreadsheet anymore. They were two people who had discovered the only currency that never devalues: love, human dignity, and the courage to start over. The city continued to hum in the distance, a million lives crossing paths, but in that small courtyard, for the first time in both their lives, there was finally a sense of home.